doesn't even have legs." The human soldier's exasperated shout echoed through the smoky bunker. The medic barely looked up from his equipment, muttering something about limited resources and prioritizing the ones who can walk. Nearby, the alien warrior lay motionless on the slab, her chest rising and falling faintly as the cacophony of the battlefield rumbled above. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, unlikely alliances, and the power of one determined soldier, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. This is a tale you won't want to miss. Lieutenant Connor Reeves wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this sector, not in this war, and certainly not babysitting a bunch of terrified recruits while the galaxy's most advanced alien empire crumbled around them. But orders were orders, and Reeves had a knack for surviving when the odds said otherwise. The alien warrior on the table? She was supposed to be dead. Shit, she was practically a miracle, having survived the orbital bombardment that had flattened everything within a 5-kilometer radius. Reeves had dragged her out himself. Her scorched armor fused to her delicate, almost insect-like exoskeleton. He hadn't noticed until later that her legs were gone, severed cleanly at the mid-thigh. Now, as the other soldiers whispered about abandoning her, Reeves felt a surge of anger he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way her mandibles twitched slightly, like she was fighting to wake up. Or maybe it was the memory of how she'd shielded a human child during the chaos, a gesture so uncharacteristic for her species that Reeves couldn't stop thinking about it. "She's one of them," a young private muttered, glancing nervously at the warrior. "You know what they did to us on Caldera. To Earth." Reeves rounded on him. "She saved lives down there. Our lives. You want to leave her because it's inconvenient." The private stammered but said nothing. The medic sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Lieutenant, even if we wanted to save her, we don't have the gear. Her physiology's too different. We can't just slap some prosthetics on her and call it a day." "Then we improvise," Reeves said, already pulling a combat knife from his belt. He didn't wait for an answer. Reeves had learned long ago that hesitation got people killed. His movements were methodical as he cut away the remnants of the alien's armor, exposing the glowing bioluminescent veins beneath. He didn't fully understand her anatomy, but he'd seen enough injuries to know when someone was running out of time. Her eyes flickered open suddenly, wide, multifaceted orbs that reflected his image 1,000 times over. Her mandibles clicked weakly, and a low hum emanated from her throat. It wasn't fear he saw in her gaze, but something closer to confusion, maybe even defiance. "Stay still," Reeves muttered. "I'm not letting you die here." The warrior's voice was barely audible, her alien tongue forming broken syllables. "Why help me?" "Because no one else will," he said simply. The bunker shook violently as another barrage hit, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. Reeves glanced at the medic, who looked like he was about to protest, but a sharp glare shut him up. "Get me a stabilizer pack," Reeves ordered, "and find something, anything, we can use for a makeshift harness." The medic hesitated, then scurried off, leaving Reeves alone with the warrior. "You've got a hell of a way of picking your battles," Reeves muttered, more to himself than to her. The warrior's mandibles twitched, and for a moment, he thought she might be smiling. Hours later, they were on the move, or what passed for movement in a war zone. Reeves had rigged up a crude harness to carry the alien on his back, her weight surprisingly light despite her size. The recruits had fallen silent, their earlier objections fading as the reality of survival took precedence. The warrior spoke occasionally, her voice growing stronger as Reeves fed her small doses of nutrient gel. Her name, he learned, was Caerthala, a mouthful, but it grew on him. She was a scout, part of an elite unit tasked with mapping enemy territory. She didn't explain why she'd saved the human child, and Reeves didn't press her. Their journey through the ruins was fraught with danger, collapsing structures, enemy patrols, and the constant threat of orbital strikes. Yet somehow, Caerthala's presence seemed to give the group an edge. She had an uncanny ability to sense danger, or antennae twitching moments before an ambush or a minefield. She's like a damn good luck charm, one of the recruits muttered, earning a rare smirk from Reeves. But luck could only take them so far. As they neared the extraction point, a new obstacle emerged, a heavily armed enemy battalion blocking their path. Retreat wasn't an option, and fighting head-on was suicide. Kaerthala's mandibles clicked in agitation. "I can distract them," she said haltingly. "Not a chance," Reeves snapped. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You've done enough. Let me repay." "No one's sacrificing themselves today," Reeves said firmly. He was already scanning the area, formulating a plan. But Kaerthala had other ideas. Before Reeves could stop her, she let out a piercing cry that reverberated through the ruins, a sound so alien and haunting that it froze the soldiers in their tracks. The enemy reacted immediately, their attention drawn to the source of the noise. Reeves cursed under his breath, realizing too late what she'd done. "Move!" he shouted to his team. As the recruits scrambled toward the extraction point, Reeves turned back, his heart pounding. Kaerthala was still on the ground, her body illuminated by the faint glow of her veins. The enemy advanced on her position, their weapons trained on the motionless figure. But she wasn't defenseless. With a guttural roar, Kaerthala unleashed a burst of energy from her thoracic core, a brilliant, blinding light that seared through the air. The enemy faltered, their formation breaking as chaos erupted. Reeves didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward her, ignoring the heat and debris. "Not leaving you behind," he growled, hoisting her onto his back once more. Kaerthala didn't argue this time. Her mandibles twitched weakly as she murmured, "Foolish human." Reeves grinned. "Takes one to know one." They reached the extraction point just as the evac shuttle descended, its engines roaring. The recruits piled in, their expressions a mix of relief and awe. As the doors closed behind them, Kaerthala glanced at Reeves, her multifaceted eyes glinting. "You risked everything." "Yeah," he said, leaning back against the shuttle wall. "But it's kind of my thing." Kaerthala's mandibles twitched again, and Reeves could have sworn it was a laugh. The shuttle rattled violently as it broke through the planet's atmosphere. Connor Reeves sat slumped against the wall, his body screaming for rest, but his mind refusing to shut down. Across from him, Kaerthala lay propped up against a cargo crate, her luminous veins dim and flickering faintly. The recruits were huddled near the cockpit, whispering amongst themselves. Some cast furtive glances at the alien warrior, but none of them spoke to her directly. "She's the reason we're alive," Reeves finally said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The private from earlier, the one who'd protested saving her in the bunker, shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think it would end like this." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "What? You thought she'd sprout wings and start singing the anthem? She's just a soldier, like the rest of us." Kaerthala let out a soft, chittering noise. "Wings would be useful." Reeves chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, well, you'll have to settle for being carried like a sack of potatoes." The tension in the shuttle eased slightly, the recruits exchanging faint smiles. Even in the midst of war, humor had a way of sneaking in, softening the edges of fear and exhaustion. Kaerthala tilted her head toward Reeves, her multifaceted eyes catching the dim light. "Human humor is strange, but comforting." "Glad you're enjoying the show," Reeves said, leaning his head back. "Now get some rest. We're not out of the woods yet." The warrior's mandibles twitched, but she obeyed, her breathing slowing as she slipped into a state of rest. Reeves watched her for a moment longer, wondering how they'd gone from mortal enemies to whatever this was. The shuttle jerked suddenly, snapping him out of his thoughts. "We've got company," the pilot shouted from the cockpit. Reeves was on his feet instantly, bracing himself against the wall as the shuttle swerved violently. Through the viewport, he caught a glimpse of sleek enemy fighters bearing down on them, their weapons charging. "Can't we outrun them?" a recruit yelled. "Not with this load," the pilot barked back. "We're sitting ducks." Reeves glanced at Caerthala, who was stirring, her antennae twitching as she picked up on the tension. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, he saw a spark of determination. "You've got an idea, don't you?" he asked. Caerthala struggled to sit up, her voice steady despite her weakened state. "I can guide the weapons. Redirect." "Redirect? How?" She tapped the glowing core in her chest. "Pulse. Signal interference. But it will drain me." Reeves hesitated. The last time she'd used her energy, it had nearly killed her. But without a plan, they were dead anyway. "Can you buy us enough time to reach the fleet?" Caerthala nodded slowly. "If pilot flies close to debris field, I can confuse them." Reeves relayed the plan to the pilot, who cursed under his breath but complied, steering the shuttle toward a massive field of wreckage orbiting the planet. The recruits held on for dear life as the shuttle weaved through the twisted remains of destroyed ships. "Now!" Reeves shouted. Caerthala closed her eyes, the glow of her core intensifying. A low hum filled the cabin, growing louder and more resonant until it became a vibrating force that rattled the walls. Outside, the enemy fighters faltered, their targeting systems glitching as Caerthala's pulse scrambled their sensors. The debris field amplified the effect, creating a chaotic storm of interference. "Hold steady," the pilot yelled, maneuvering the shuttle through the chaos. Caerthala's glow dimmed rapidly, her energy spent. She slumped against the crate, her breathing shallow. Reeves rushed to her side, checking her vitals. "You did it," he said softly. "They're breaking off." Caerthala's mandibles twitched faintly. "Told you, foolish human." Yeah, you can lecture me later." The shuttle emerged from the debris field just as a friendly cruiser came into view. The recruits cheered, relief washing over them. Reeves, however, couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him as he looked at Caerthala's fragile form. On board the cruiser, Caerthala was rushed to the medbay, where a team of human and alien medics worked together to stabilize her. Reeves paced outside, his mind racing. He didn't know what kind of future awaited her, or if there even was one. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Lieutenant Reeves?" He turned to see Admiral Harlow, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Sir," Reeves said, snapping to attention. Harlow waved him off. "At ease. I've been briefed on your unconventional rescue mission." Reeves braced himself for a reprimand, but to his surprise, Harlow's expression softened. "That alien warrior you saved, Caerthala, was it? She's one of the last of her kind. The intel she carries could be invaluable." Reeves frowned. "Intel? She didn't mention anything about." "She wouldn't," Harlow said. "Her species was bred for secrecy, even under duress. But if she trusts you, maybe she'll talk." Reeves felt a pang of guilt. Caerthala hadn't asked for any of this. Being rescued, being interrogated, being used as a tool in a war she clearly had no love for. "I'll talk to her," Reeves said finally. "Good," Harlow replied. "And, Lieutenant, you did the right thing out there. Not just for her, for all of us." Reeves nodded, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavier on his shoulders. He didn't just save Caerthala because it was the right thing. Somewhere along the way, he'd started to see her not as an enemy or even an ally, but as a person, someone worth fighting for. As he stepped into the medbay, Caerthala's eyes fluttered open, her gaze meeting his. "You came back," she murmured. Reeves smiled faintly. "Told you. I'm stubborn like that." Her mandibles twitched in what might have been a smile. "Foolish human." "Yeah, well," he said, pulling up a chair. "Maybe foolishness isn't so bad." Caerthala spent the next several days in the cruiser's medbay, recovering under the watchful eyes of the medical team. Despite the array of alien and human technology at their disposal, her unique physiology presented constant challenges. Reeves checked in whenever he could, though he was careful not to hover. The crew, however, was less subtle. Rumors spread quickly, as they always did, about the alien warrior in the medbay and the lieutenant who wouldn't leave her side. Some of the stories bordered on the absurd. That she was a spy, a traitor, or even Reeves's secret lover. He ignored the gossip as best he could, though he couldn't help rolling his eyes when a particularly wild version reached his ears. Caerthala seemed vaguely amused by the attention, her mandibles twitching in what Reeves had come to recognize as her version of a grin. "Humans talk too much," she said one afternoon, her voice stronger now. "You're not wrong," Reeves admitted, pulling up a chair. "They'll get bored soon enough." Caerthala tilted her head, studying him. "You are different. Most would not bother. Most people don't think too hard about what's right," Reeves replied. "They just do what's easy." Her multifaceted eyes flickered with a faint glow. "Easy is survival. Your choice is strange." "Maybe," Reeves said, "but I'd rather be strange than useless." Caerthala chittered softly, the sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Reeves leaned back, resting his hands behind his head. "Speaking of strange," he said, "the brass thinks you've got some kind of intel we can use. Something about maps or tactics. Sound familiar?" Caerthala's mandibles stopped moving. Her antennae twitched slightly, a subtle sign of tension Reeves had learned to recognize. "I know things," she said carefully, "but not all useful to you." "Let me guess," Reeves said, leaning forward. "Your people don't share secrets with outsiders." Her gaze hardened. "Not just outsiders. Anyone." Reeves considered this for a moment. He wasn't about to force her into anything. She'd been through enough already. But if she was sitting on something that could turn the tide of the war, it wasn't just about her anymore. "Look," he said, his tone softer now, "I'm not asking you to betray anyone. I need to know if there's a way to end this, without more people dying." Caerthala was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. For me." Reeves frowned. "What kind of danger?" She hesitated, her mandibles clicking faintly. "My core holds more than energy. Memories. Knowledge. If I go unlock it, I can share. But the process..." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the glowing veins in her arms. "It could kill you," Reeves finished for her. Caerthala nodded. Reeves exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "Then we're not doing it. Not unless we've got no other choice." Caerthala looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You would refuse? Even if it means ending the war?" "Yeah," Reeves said without hesitation. "Because I'm not about to trade one life for another. Not yours, not anyone's." For a moment, Caerthala said nothing. Then, to Reeves' surprise, she let out a soft, chittering laugh. "Foolish human," she said, shaking her head. "Yeah, I'm getting that a lot lately," Reeves replied, grinning. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Harlow, who strode into the medbay with his usual air of authority. "Lieutenant Reeves," Harlow said, nodding briefly before turning to Caerthala. "And our guest of honor." Caerthala regarded him cautiously, but said nothing. "I'll get to the point," Harlow continued. "We've intercepted transmissions indicating an enemy fleet is gathering near the Helion system. If they consolidate their forces, it could spell disaster for the Alliance." Reeves frowned. "What's that got to do with us?" "We need someone who knows their tactics," Harlow said, glancing at Caerthala. "Someone who can predict their movements, find their weak points." Reeves folded his arms. "And you think she's just going to hand over that information?" Harlow's expression didn't waver. "I think she wants this war to end as much as we do. Am I wrong?" Caerthala's antennae twitched, her gaze shifting between Harlow and Reeves. Finally, she spoke. "I will help, but not for your war. For survival." Harlow nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. "Good. Prepare her for the briefing. We don't have much time." As the Admiral left, Reeves turned back to Caerthala, his brow furrowed. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Caerthala tilted her head. "Survival is not just living. It is protecting." You understand this. Reeves sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, I do. Doesn't mean I like it. Kaerthala's mandibles twitched faintly. Neither do I. The briefing room was a flurry of activity, filled with officers, analysts, and holographic projections of the Helion system. Kaerthala stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding despite her weakened state. Reeves stayed close, watching as she shared insights about enemy formations and supply lines. Her knowledge was precise, her observations invaluable. The officers were impressed, though some still regarded her with suspicion. Are you sure about this? Reeves asked her quietly as the briefing concluded. Kaerthala's multifaceted eyes met his. No, but it is necessary. Reeves nodded, his jaw tightening. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something far bigger than either of them. As the officers dispersed, Harlow approached them, his expression grim. "Lieutenant," he said, "you and Kaerthala will accompany the strike team. We need her guidance on the ground." Reeves's eyes widened. "On the ground? She's barely recovered," she insisted. Harlow interrupted. Reeves turned to Kaerthala, his voice sharp. "Are you serious? You could get yourself killed." Kaerthala's mandibles twitched in what might have been amusement. "And you would not." Reeves shook his head, exasperated. "This is insane." "Perhaps," Kaerthala said, "but we are good at surviving." "Yes." Reeves sighed, a reluctant grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, I guess we are." As they prepared for the mission, Reeves couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end, or just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The strike team's transport ship hurtled through the void, cloaked in silence save for the hum of its engines. Reeves sat across from Kaerthala, his helmet resting in his lap. Around them, the other soldiers double-checked their gear, their faces a mix of determination and unease. Kaerthala adjusted the harness strapped across her torso, her alien physiology requiring custom modifications that made her armor look like a patchwork of human and XRA design. Despite her weakened state, her posture remained confident. Reeves couldn't decide if it was bravery or sheer stubbornness. "All right, listen up," barked Commander Dreyfus, the mission lead. "We're hitting a forward staging base. Intel says they're stockpiling weapons and fuel for their fleet. We take out their supply lines, and we cripple their operations in Helion." Kaerthala's antennae twitched. "Their defenses will be layered. Expect resistance." Dreyfus shot her a look that hovered between respect and mistrust. "That's why you're here. You lead us through the traps. We do the rest." Reeves glanced at Kaerthala, wondering how much pressure she could take. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You sure you're ready for this?" She tilted her head toward him. "Survival is not waiting. It is action." Before Reeves could respond, the ship jolted violently. Alarms blared, and the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Incoming fire. Hold on." Reeves barely had time to grab a handrail before the transport pitched sharply, evading a barrage of plasma rounds. The other soldiers braced themselves, their expressions turning grim. "Enemy patrols spotted us," the pilot shouted. "We're going in hot." Kaerthala's multifaceted eyes narrowed as she unbuckled her harness. "I can disrupt their targeting." Briefly, Reeves grabbed her arm. "You're not draining yourself again. We need you on the ground." Her mandibles twitched. "Then you distract." Reeves blinked, realizing what she was implying. "You want me to? Do not argue, foolish human." With no time to debate, Reeves relayed her plan to Dreyfus, who nodded sharply. "All right, Lieutenant, you heard her. Get to the turret." Reeves scrambled to the turret controls, the cold metal grips familiar under his hands. As the transport swung around, he aimed at the pursuing fighters, unleashing a barrage of return fire. The soldiers around him shouted encouragement, though he barely heard them over the roar of the turret. Kaerthala moved to the cockpit, directing the pilot through evasive maneuvers. Her voice, calm and precise, cut through the chaos. "Bank left." Dive. Use debris for cover. Under her guidance, the transport weaved through a field of shattered starships, the wreckage providing temporary shelter from enemy fire. The fighters hesitated, their pilots wary of the unpredictable terrain. Keep them distracted, Dreyfus shouted. We're almost at the drop zone. Reeves gritted his teeth, the turret overheating as he pushed it to its limits. Just tell me when to jump. The ship shuddered as it took a glancing hit, but Caerthala's plan had worked. The fighters broke off, unwilling to risk the debris field. The transport dove toward the planet's surface, its engines straining under the rapid descent. Touchdown in 60 seconds, the pilot called. Reeves stumbled back into the hold, grabbing his gear. Caerthala was already waiting, her armor gleaming faintly in the dim light. "You all right?" he asked, scanning her for signs of strain. She nodded. "Focus on mission. I will adapt." Reeves didn't have time to argue. The transport slammed into the ground, the ramp dropping open as soldiers poured out into the chaos of the battlefield. The enemy base loomed ahead, a sprawling fortress bristling with defenses. Plasma bolts lit up the night, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. "Move, move, move," Dreyfus shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Caerthala took point, her movements swift and deliberate despite her injuries. She led them through the chaos, her intimate knowledge of XRA tactics proving invaluable. She pointed out weak spots in the perimeter, guided them around minefields, and identified blind spots in the enemy's patrol routes. Reeves stayed close, his rifle at the ready. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every scan of the area came up empty. "Anyone else getting a bad feeling about this?" he muttered. Caerthala didn't respond immediately. Then, her antennae twitched sharply. "Trap." The word barely left her mandibles before the ground erupted beneath them. The shockwave threw Reeves off his feet, the world spinning as he hit the ground hard. Dazed, he scrambled to his knees, his ears ringing. Around him, soldiers were shouting, firing at unseen attackers. Caerthala was already moving, her claws slashing through the smoke to reveal a squad of enemy combatants. Her strikes were precise, her movements fluid despite her condition. "Fall back," Dreyfus ordered, rallying the team. Reeves covered their retreat, his rifle barking as he laid down suppressive fire. He saw Caerthala stumble, her energy clearly waning, but she didn't stop. "Reeves!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. He turned just in time to see an enemy soldier lunging at him. Before he could react, Caerthala intercepted the attack, her blade slicing through the air in a blur of motion. The enemy fell, but the effort cost her. She dropped to one knee, breathing heavily. Reeves rushed to her side, pulling her back to cover. "You're gonna get yourself killed. Better me than you," she rasped, her eyes flickering with faint light. "Not happening," Reeves snapped. "You're not dying on me. Not today." Caerthala chittered weakly, her mandibles twitching. "Foolish human." Yeah, Reeves muttered, slinging her arm over his shoulder. "Save it for when we're not getting shot at." As they regrouped with the team, Dreyfus gave them a quick once-over. "You two still in one piece?" "More or less," Reeves replied, though Caerthala's condition worried him. "Good. Because we've got a problem," Dreyfus said grimly. He pointed to the fortress ahead, where reinforcements were pouring out in droves. "They're onto us. If we don't take out that command center now, we're toast." Caerthala straightened, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "I can guide you, but we must move quickly." Reeves glanced at her, his jaw tightening. He didn't like the idea of pushing her further, but they didn't have a choice. "All right," he said, gripping his rifle. "Let's finish this." The fortress loomed ahead like a beast awakening, its defenses bristling with activity. Turrets rotated, seeking targets, while enemy soldiers swarmed the battlements. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the air, turning the battlefield into a hellish maze of fire and smoke. Reeves gripped his rifle tightly, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. Caerthala moved ahead, her steps deliberate despite her visible exhaustion. The veins of energy running along her limbs flickered irregularly, a sign Reeves recognized as dangerous. "You're running on fumes," he muttered, catching up to her. She didn't break stride. "We must finish." Dreyfus signaled the team to take cover behind a line of debris. His face was grim, his voice clipped as he outlined their next move. "We're splitting into 2 teams. Bravo will lay down suppressive fire and draw their attention. Alpha will infiltrate through the eastern access tunnel." "Let me guess," Reeves said. "We're Alpha." "You catch on fast, Lieutenant," Dreyfus replied, smirking. Caerthala studied the fortress for a moment before pointing toward a barely visible gap in the defenses. "There, a weak point. Minimal patrols, but reinforced by drones." "Great," Reeves muttered, because this wasn't hard enough already. Dreyfus ignored him. "Alpha, you're with me. Caerthala, you lead the way. Let's move." The team darted from cover, zigzagging through the chaos to avoid enemy fire. Reeves stayed close to Caerthala, his rifle at the ready. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal, but he pushed through, focused on the mission and on keeping her alive. When they reached the eastern tunnel, Caerthala motioned for the team to halt. She crouched low, her antennae twitching as she scanned the area. "Drones ahead," she said. 2, no, 3. Patterns predictable. Wait for rotation. Dreyfus gave her a sharp nod. "All right, follow her lead." Reeves watched as Caerthala crept forward, her movements fluid and silent. She timed her steps perfectly with the drone's rotations, slipping through their line of sight like a shadow. The rest of the team followed her example, holding their breath as they navigated the narrow corridor. At the end of the tunnel, they found themselves at a heavy blast door. Caerthala examined the control panel, her mandibles twitching in concentration. "Can you crack it?" Reeves asked. "Yes," she said, "but it will alert them." "Of course it will," Dreyfus muttered. "All right, people, get ready. As soon as that door opens, we're going in hot." Reeves positioned himself near Caerthala, his heart pounding. "How long will it take?" She didn't answer, her claws dancing over the alien interface. The veins in her arms glowed brighter, and Reeves realized she was channeling energy directly into the panel. "Caerthala," he said, his voice low. "Don't push yourself too hard." She glanced at him briefly, her eyes glinting with determination. "Focus on surviving. Let me work." The door hissed open with a groan of ancient hydraulics, and all hell broke loose. Enemy soldiers were already waiting, their weapons blazing as they unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. Reeves dove for cover, firing back as the team pushed forward. Caerthala stayed close, her movements precise as she directed the team toward cover points and choke points. "Move up," Dreyfus shouted. "Take that high ground." Reeves spotted a ledge that would give them a tactical advantage, but it was heavily guarded. "Caerthala, any ideas?" She pointed to a cluster of conduits running along the wall. "Overload those. Chain reaction will clear the path." Reeves nodded, relaying the plan to the team. He covered Caerthala as she moved to the conduits, her claws slicing through cables with practiced ease. Sparks flew, and a low hum built to a deafening roar. "Get back!" Reeves shouted, grabbing Caerthala and pulling her to safety just as the conduits exploded in a shower of fire and debris. The blast took out the enemy guards and the team surged forward, securing the high ground. Reeves helped Caerthala to her feet, his voice sharp. "You're insane, you know that." "Necessary," she replied simply, though her legs wobbled slightly beneath her. As they advanced deeper into the fortress, the resistance grew fiercer. Enemy reinforcements poured in, and the team was forced into a brutal firefight. Reeves and Caerthala fought side by side, their movements synchronized as if they'd been working together for years. "Almost there," Dreyfus shouted, pointing to a massive central chamber. That's the command center. The room was heavily fortified, its walls lined with defensive turrets and shield generators. Kaerthala assessed the situation quickly, her antennae twitching. Shields are linked to core. Disable it and defenses fall. And where's the core? Reeves asked. She pointed to a glowing structure at the far end of the chamber. There, but guarded. Reeves glanced at Dreyfus, who nodded grimly. We'll cover you. Get it done. Kaerthala didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the core, her movements a blur as she dodged enemy fire. Reeves followed her, his rifle blazing as he took out targets in her path. Reeves, look out! Her warning came too late. An enemy soldier lunged at him, knocking his rifle from his hands. Reeves grappled with the attacker, his muscles straining as he fought to keep the blade away from his throat. Kaerthala intervened, her claws slicing through the attacker with brutal efficiency. She helped Reeves to his feet, her voice urgent. No time, go! They reached the core, its pulsing energy filling the air with an ominous hum. Kaerthala placed her hands on the control panel, her veins glowing brighter than ever. What are you doing? Reeves asked, his voice tight with concern. Overriding, she said. We'll take all energy. All of it. Reeves's stomach dropped. You mean necessary, she said firmly. Before he could stop her, the core began to dim, its energy siphoned away by Kaerthala's glowing form. The shields fell, and the turrets powered down, leaving the fortress vulnerable. Shields are down! Dreyfus shouted. Finish the jobs! Reeves turned to Kaerthala, who was slumping against the console. Her eyes flickered weakly, her voice barely audible. Go now! I'm not leaving you, he snapped, grabbing her arm. You must survive, she whispered. Reeves gritted his teeth, his heart pounding as the team pressed the assault. He wasn't about to let her sacrifice herself. Not if he could help it. But as the enemy reinforcements surged into the chamber, Reeves realized he might not have a choice. Kaerthala's energy faded rapidly, her glow dimming as her legs buckled. Reeves caught her before she collapsed entirely, her weight heavy against him. Around them, the team was locked in a brutal fight, trading fire with enemy reinforcements. The fortress command center echoed with chaos, shouted orders, the hiss of plasma bolts and the dull roar of distant explosions. Reeves! Dreyfus's voice cut through the noise. Get her out of here. We'll hold them off. No chance, Reeves shot back, his grip tightening around Kaerthala. We finish this together. Kaerthala stirred weakly, her mandibles clicking as she tried to speak. You must leave. Fortress will fall. Reeves shook his head, his jaw tightening. Not without you. We started this together. We're ending it together. Lieutenant, Dreyfus barked. That's an order. But Reeves wasn't listening. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a cluster of explosives the team had brought. An idea formed. Reckless, but their only shot. Kaerthala, he said urgently. Can you buy us a few seconds? Just enough to set those charges. Her multifaceted eyes flickered faintly, her antennae twitching as if weighing the cost. For seconds, I can. Good, Reeves said, already moving toward the explosives. Just hold on. Kaerthala struggled to her feet, leaning against the console for support. She raised her claws, channeling what little energy she had left. A faint shield flickered to life around them, barely strong enough to deflect the incoming fire. Reeves grabbed the charges, his hands moving quickly as he armed them. Sweat dripped down his face, but he kept his focus. Almost there, the shield began to crack, the strain evident in Kaerthala's trembling form. Still, she held on, her determination unshakable. Charges set. Reeves shouted, slamming the last one into place. Fall back. The team began retreating, laying down suppressive fire as they moved toward the exit. Reeves stayed close to Kaerthala, practically carrying her as they navigated the chaos. 5 seconds, Dreyfus shouted. His voice barely audible over the din. Reeves pushed harder, his legs burning as they sprinted through the corridors. Behind them, the charges detonated, the shockwave tearing through the fortress. The walls shook violently, debris raining down as the structure began to collapse. Reeves shielded Kaerthala as best he could, his body aching with the effort. "Keep moving," Dreyfus urged, his voice strained. They emerged into the open air just as the fortress crumbled behind them, a massive explosion lighting up the night sky. The ground shook beneath their feet, and for a moment, all Reeves could hear was the pounding of his own heart. "Status check," Dreyfus called, his voice hoarse. "All accounted for," a soldier replied, though their tone was heavy with exhaustion. Reeves lowered Kaerthala gently to the ground, his hands shaking. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. "You did it," he said softly, his voice breaking. Kaerthala's mandibles twitched in what might have been a smile. "You humans. Stubborn." Reeves laughed despite himself, his chest tight. "Takes one to know one." Dreyfus approached, his expression unreadable. He crouched beside Kaerthala, his tone surprisingly gentle. "She's the reason we're alive. Get her to the med bay. Now." Reeves didn't wait for further orders. He scooped Kaerthala into his arms, her weight oddly light despite her alien physiology. The team's transport ship was waiting, its engines humming as the ramp lowered. The flight back to base was tense, the silence broken only by the soft beeping of medical monitors. Reeves stayed by Kaerthala's side, refusing to leave even as the medics worked to stabilize her. "She's tough," one of them said, glancing at Reeves. "But whatever she did back there, it drained her completely." Reeves nodded, his throat tight. "She's tougher than all of us." Kaerthala stirred faintly, her voice a whisper. "Reeves." He leaned closer, his heart pounding. "I'm here. Mission success?" He smiled, his eyes stinging. "Yeah, we did it. You did it." Her antennae twitched weakly. "Then it was worth." "Don't talk like that," Reeves said, his voice shaking. "You're gonna pull through. You hear me? You don't get to quit now." Kaerthala chittered softly, her version of laughter. "Stubborn human." Reeves held her hand tightly, his voice firm despite the tears threatening to fall. "Yeah, well, you're stuck with me. So hang on." As the med bay's monitors beeped steadily, Reeves silently vowed to do whatever it took to save her. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time he felt hope. Hope that alliances could be forged, that the impossible could be achieved, and that no one, no matter how different, had to face the fight alone. Kaerthala's recovery was slow but steady. The medics worked tirelessly, their efforts bolstered by advanced human and alien technology. Reeves rarely left her side, even when the base commander ordered him to rest. He ignored the suggestions, his focus solely on the warrior who had risked everything to save them. The aftermath of the mission had left the team reeling. The fortress's destruction was a critical blow to the enemy, and the intel they recovered hinted at even greater threats ahead. But for now, the victory was theirs, and it carried a weight of bittersweet relief. Kaerthala stirred one evening, her antennae twitching as her multifaceted eyes opened slowly. Reeves, sitting in the chair beside her bed, straightened immediately. "Hey," he said softly, his voice thick with relief. "Welcome back." She blinked at him, her gaze unfocused for a moment before recognition set in. "Reeves, you had us worried," he said, forcing a grin. "But I knew you'd pull through. Too stubborn to let go, right?" Her mandibles twitched in what he'd come to recognize as amusement. "You would not let me." "Damn right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Besides, who else is going to argue with me about tactics and call me a stubborn human?" Her gaze softened, and for a moment, there was no need for words. The bond they'd forged in battle was undeniable, a connection born of shared struggles and mutual respect. "How is the team?" she asked, her voice faint but steady. "They're good," Reeves said. "Recovering just like you." Dreyfus is already planning the next mission. Figures, right? The guy doesn't know how to sit still. Caerthala nodded slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window. The sky outside was clear, the stars shining brightly. A stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. "You're a hero, you know," Reeves said after a moment. She turned her gaze back to him, her expression unreadable. "A hero, no. A warrior, perhaps." "Hero," he insisted. "You didn't just fight, you saved lives. You gave us hope." Her antennae lowered slightly, a gesture of humility he hadn't seen before. "Hope is fragile, but perhaps worth fighting for." "Damn right it is," Reeves said, leaning forward. "And you're proof of that." For the next few days, Caerthala's strength returned in small increments. She began walking again, albeit with assistance, her determination as fierce as ever. Reeves stayed close, offering support when needed and cracking jokes to lighten the mood. One afternoon, as they walked the length of the med bay together, Caerthala paused, her antennae twitching. "Reeves," she said, her tone unusually serious. "There is something I must say." He frowned slightly, sensing the weight of her words. "What is it?" "You are unlike others of your kind," she said, her gaze steady. "Most humans see my people as tools, weapons, but you see more." Reeves shrugged, trying to downplay her praise. "I just see someone who deserves a fighting chance. That's all." "No," she said firmly. "It is more. You saw me, not as alien, not as warrior, but as—" Caerthala. The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. "Well," he said finally, scratching the back of his neck, "I guess you kind of grew on me." Her mandibles twitched again, and he realized she was laughing. "Reeves," she said, her tone lighter now, "you are unique." "I'll take that as a compliment," he said with a grin. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dreyfus, his expression serious as he approached. "Reeves, Caerthala," he said, nodding to each of them. "We've got intel on the next target. Command wants us ready to move soon." Reeves frowned. "Soon?" She just started walking again. Caerthala straightened, her gaze sharpening. "I will be ready." "Care," Reeves began, but she cut him off with a raised claw. "I am a warrior," she said. "This fight is not over." Dreyfus smirked slightly. "Glad to hear it. We'll need every hand we can get." As he walked away, Reeves turned to Caerthala, his expression torn. "You sure about this?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with resolve. "The fight is for all of us. Together, we will win." Reeves nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "All right, but you're sticking with me, got it? No more solo heroics." Her mandibles twitched. "Agreed. Stubborn human. And stubborn alien," he shot back. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. The road ahead would be long and perilous, but together they were unstoppable. The warrior and the soldier, an unlikely pair, bound by trust and a shared purpose. And no matter what came next, Reeves knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't face it alone. The next mission loomed like a shadow over the base. Command briefings were tense, and the air carried an undercurrent of unease. This wasn't just another strike. It was a kind of operation that could define the outcome of the war. For Reeves and Caerthala, it was a chance to prove that their alliance wasn't just an anomaly, but the foundation of something greater. As the team prepped for deployment, Caerthala worked alongside them, her movements steady and precise. She had regained much of her strength, though Reeves still caught her wincing now and then. She refused to acknowledge it when he asked, brushing off his concern with her usual stoicism. "You're pushing too hard," he said one evening as they checked their gear in the armory. "I am prepared," she replied without looking up. "Prepared doesn't mean indestructible," Reeves said, his tone firm. "You don't have to do this alone." Caerthala paused, her mandibles twitching thoughtfully. "I know," she said finally, her gaze softening as it met his. That is why I am here. Reeves nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. All right, stubborn alien, let's do this. The mission was a coordinated assault on a heavily fortified enemy stronghold deep within hostile territory. Intelligence suggested it housed a critical communications hub, one that, if destroyed, would cripple the enemy's ability to coordinate their fleets. As the dropship descended through turbulent skies, the team sat in tense silence, their expressions grim. Kaer Thala, seated beside Reeves, glanced at him. You seem calm, she observed. Calm, he said with a snort. I'm holding it together with duct tape and a prayer. She tilted her head, clearly unfamiliar with the reference. Duct tape? It's a human thing, he said, grinning despite himself. Basically, I'm faking it. Ah, she said, her mandibles twitching in what he assumed was amusement. Then you are convincing. Good, he replied, because I'm about as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Kaer Thala stared at him, clearly trying to parse the metaphor. Your idioms are strange. Yeah, well, stick around long enough and you'll hear worse. The dropship jolted as it hit the ground, the ramp lowering with a hiss. Reeves's humor faded instantly, his expression hardening. Let's move, Dreyfus barked, leading the team into the fray. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Enemy forces swarmed like locusts, their weapons lighting up the dark terrain. Reeves and Kaer Thala moved in sync, covering each other as they advanced toward the objective. Kaer Thala's combat prowess was a sight to behold. Despite her recovery, she fought with a precision and ferocity that left Reeves in awe. Her claws sliced through enemy lines, her energy blasts carving paths through the chaos. But the enemy wasn't going down without a fight. Heavy artillery rained down, forcing the team to scatter for cover. Reeves cursed under his breath as he ducked behind a crumbling wall, his heart pounding. Reeves! Kaer Thala's voice cut through the noise, sharp with urgency. He turned just in time to see a massive enemy mech bearing down on their position. Its cannon swiveled toward them, charging with an ominous hum. Not today, Reeves muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. Kaer Thala leaped forward, her claws glowing with energy as she attacked the mech's legs. Sparks flew as she tore through its armor, but the machine retaliated with a swing of its massive arm, sending her crashing into the ground. Kaer! Reeves shouted, adrenaline surging as he fired at the mech's exposed joints. The distraction was enough for Kaer Thala to recover. With a guttural roar, she plunged her claws into the mech's core, ripping out its power source. The machine sputtered before collapsing in a heap of twisted metal. Reeves rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he helped her up. You all right? He asked, his voice tight. I am functional, she replied, though her movements were slower now. Good, because I can't carry you and fight a war at the same time. Her mandibles twitched faintly. I will keep moving. They pressed on, the objective finally in sight. The communications hub loomed ahead, its defenses formidable. Charges are set. Dreyfus called over the comms. We've got 3 minutes to clear out. Reeves and Kaer Thala provided cover as the team retreated, their movements a blur of coordinated efficiency. The enemy pressed harder, desperate to stop them, but they held their ground. As the final countdown began, Kaer Thala turned to Reeves. Reeves, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. If this is the end. It's not, he interrupted, his gaze fierce. We're getting out of here. Together. She hesitated, then nodded. Together, they ran, the explosion ripping through the air just as they cleared the blast radius. The shockwave sent them sprawling, but when Reeves looked up, Kaer Thala was still beside him, her eyes shining with determination. You did good, Kaer, he said, his voice hoarse. And you, stubborn human, she replied, her mandibles twitching. As the team regrouped, battered but alive, Reeves felt a surge of pride. They had faced impossible odds and come out on top, not as humans and aliens, but as comrades. And for the first time, he believed they might actually win this war. The team returned to base in the early hours, their ship touching down with a heavy thud. The mission had been a success, but it had come at a cost. Several soldiers had been wounded, and Dreyfus's usual sharp demeanor was subdued as he led the team to the med bay for a quick debrief. Kaer Thala, despite her own exhaustion, helped carry supplies and assist the wounded, her movements graceful but slow. Reeves kept a careful eye on her, noting the faint limp in her step. "You're pushing yourself," he said quietly, stepping alongside her. "I am fine," she replied, her voice steady, but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "Fine doesn't mean healthy," he said, voice tight with concern. Her antennae twitched, a sign of frustration, or maybe something else. "You do not need to worry about me." "Too bad," he said with a grin. "I've already started." She shot him a glance, her expression unreadable, but there was something there, something soft beneath the layers of battle-hardened exterior. They entered the med bay, and the staff immediately took over, directing the soldiers to various stations for treatment. Kaer Thala was ushered to a bed, and Reeves reluctantly let go of her arm. "I will be fine," she repeated, though this time there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "I know," he said, his tone softer now. "But you don't have to do this alone. Not anymore." The words hung between them, and for a moment, Kaer Thala seemed lost in thought. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze distant. "Humans," she said finally, almost to herself. "You are complicated." "Yeah, tell me about it," he said with a wry smile. "But we've got your back, Kaer." Her mandibles twitched, the faintest hint of a smile on her face as she looked at him. "You are strange." "I'll take that as a compliment," he said, his grin widening. The conversation was interrupted by Dreyfus, who walked over to them with a clipboard in hand. "Reeves, Kaer Thala," he said, his voice a little gruffer than usual. "You both did good out there. We've got a few hours before the next briefing, so take it easy. Rest up." Reeves nodded, but Kaer Thala shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "I will not rest," she said, her voice firm. "There is still work to be done." Dreyfus raised an eyebrow. "Kaer Thala, take a break for once." "Resting is for the weak," she replied flatly, her posture stiffening. Reeves couldn't help but chuckle at her stubbornness. "We've been through worse, haven't we?" Kaer Thala gave him a side eye, her mandibles twitching in what was almost a smirk. "You humans are not as weak as you seem. Nice of you to notice," he said, his smile widening. As the team dispersed to take care of the post-mission details, Reeves found himself lingering at Kaer Thala's side. There was something different now, a subtle shift in their dynamic. They had been through too much together, fought too many battles side by side, for it to be anything but real. The mission had tested them both, pushed them to their limits and beyond. But it had also proven something else. They were more than just soldiers. They were a team. And as they prepared for whatever came next, Reeves knew one thing for certain. Together, they were unstoppable. "You sure you don't need a break?" he asked, his voice quiet as they stood outside the med bay. Kaer Thala's eyes met his, and for a moment, the warrior within her softened. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "I will take a break. But only because you asked." Reeves grinned. "That's all I needed to hear." Their laughter was brief, but it was enough to remind them both that, in the end, no matter the odds, they had each other's backs. And that made all the difference. As the sun set outside the base, casting a warm glow over the horizon, Reeves allowed himself to hope once more. The war was far from over, but they had already won something far more important. Trust, loyalty, and a bond that couldn't be broken. And as long as they fought together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The quiet after the mission was short-lived. Within days, the war shifted once more, the enemy reacting with relentless fury. The communications hub they destroyed had been critical, but it hadn't taken long for the alien forces to regroup and mobilize even more devastating weaponry. A new threat emerged, a massive fleet heading straight for the planet. Reeves had barely finished his last cup of coffee before Dreyfus called them into a briefing. The room was filled with tension, officers moving like shadows, their faces drawn and weary. "This is it," Dreyfus said, voice grim. "The final push. We hit their fleet now, or we risk losing everything." Kaer Thala, standing beside Reeves, looked every bit the warrior she was, though still recovering. Her presence was commanding. Her eyes scanned the digital map of the enemy forces, calculating. "How do we win this?" Reeves asked, leaning over the table, eyes fixed on the coordinates blinking on the screen. Dreyfus pointed to a line of ships. "We cripple their command ship. Without it, the fleet will fall apart. But the ship is heavily fortified. It'll be a suicide run unless we have a plan." Reeves exchanged a glance with Kaer Thala. "We don't have time for anything complicated." "I will go," Kaer Thala said, her voice steady. "You're still recovering." Reeves protested immediately. "You can't." "I am fine," she interrupted, her mandibles set in a hard line. "I will go. I will fight." The determination in her voice left no room for argument. Kaer Thala had always been stubborn, but now there was an edge to it. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a leader. "You're not alone in this," Reeves said firmly, looking at Dreyfus for confirmation. "I'm going too." Dreyfus hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. We're all in this together, but we need to move fast. The fleet is closing in." The next few hours were a blur of final preparations. Weapons were checked, armor reinforced, and each soldier seemed to move with a singular focus. The fate of their world rested on this mission, and everyone knew it. Reeves, Kaer Thala, and the rest of the team boarded their ship in silence, the gravity of the situation settling in. The engines roared to life, and as the ship took off, the stars outside seemed to blur into streaks of light. "Here we go," Reeves muttered, tightening his grip on the controls. "Ready, human?" Kaer Thala's voice came through the comms, a mix of amusement and seriousness. "Always," he replied, flashing a grin at her. The battle was as chaotic as expected. The skies above the planet erupted with gunfire, laser blasts lighting up the dark expanse. Ships were scattered, moving in every direction, dodging fire and returning it in kind. It was a frenzied dance of destruction, and in the center of it all, their ship headed straight for the heart of the enemy fleet. "Command ship dead ahead," Dreyfus called out from the back. "We're going to make this count." The enemy defenses were formidable. Shields flickered, weapons fired from all directions, and massive debris fields formed as ships collided in the chaos. But Kaer Thala wasn't deterred. She stood at the ship's weapons console, her claws steady as she fired at anything that moved. "Stay close." She barked over the comms as a barrage of fire lit up the space around them. Reeves navigated the ship with precision, dodging blasts and returning fire when he had the chance. But it was clear that they were up against something far larger than they had anticipated. "We need a way in," Reeves yelled. "Kaer, what do you need from me?" "Hold steady," she commanded. "I will find a weakness." Reeves nodded, focusing on his maneuvering. The seconds felt like hours, and the enemy ship loomed closer with every breath. Finally, Kaer Thala's voice came through again, this time sharper, more determined. "I have it," she said, a rare note of triumph in her voice. "I found a weak point in their defenses. Get me close." Reeves punched the throttle, sending their ship careening toward the command ship. They were almost within range when the enemy fired a direct hit. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring. Kaer Thala's grip on her console tightened, her expression grim. "We can't take another hit," Reeves shouted. "Hold on." With a final surge of power, he swung the ship in a tight arc, sending them within range of the command ship's exposed flank. Caerthala's claws danced across the controls, her eyes locked in concentration. "Now!" she shouted. Reeves fired, the shot landing directly in the weak spot Caerthala had identified. The enemy ship erupted in a massive explosion, sending shockwaves through the surrounding area. The command ship was destroyed. The fleet's coordination crumbled. The remaining enemy ships scattered, unable to maintain their formations. "We did it," Reeves muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Caerthala looked at him, her expression unreadable, but her mandibles twitched, and that was all the answer he needed. The battle was far from over, but they had dealt a decisive blow. With the command ship gone, the enemy forces were disoriented, and the rest of the fleet began to retreat. Reeves allowed himself a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. The war was far from over. They had won this battle, but there would be more ahead. More sacrifices, more losses. But at least now, they knew they could stand together, and that, in itself, was a victory. As the ship set a course back to the base, Reeves glanced at Caerthala. "We're not done yet," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, "but we are stronger now." "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Together, we are." The return to base was subdued. The victory, though significant, was only the first chapter in a war that showed no signs of slowing down. The next few days were a blur of debriefings, tactical assessments, and repair work. But amidst the chaos, Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between him and Caerthala. Their bond, forged through fire and battle, had deepened, but it was unspoken. No declarations, no grand gestures, just shared glances, quiet understanding, and the occasional smile, small moments that carried more weight than words ever could. As the days passed, the base's usual bustle resumed, but there was an air of anticipation hanging over them all. The enemy was regrouping, their fleet smaller now, but they were relentless. The question wasn't if they would strike again, it was when. Reeves found himself sitting in the mess hall one evening, staring at his half-empty plate, deep in thought. The constant hum of the base, the voices of soldiers mingling in the background. It was all a distant noise. He was pulled from his reverie when Caerthala sat down across from him, her posture as disciplined as ever. "You're quiet," she said, her tone flat but observant. "Just thinking," he replied, glancing up at her. "About what comes next." "We fight," she said simply, as if the answer were obvious. Reeves chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. "Yeah, I guess that's the plan. But there's always a part of me that wonders, what if it never ends?" Caerthala's antennae twitched, a subtle shift in her otherwise rigid form. She regarded him for a long moment, and for the first time, her eyes softened just slightly. "You are not alone in that thought," she said quietly. "But that is why we fight, so that others do not have to." Reeves met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through settled between them. This wasn't just a war for survival anymore. It was a fight for a future. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I still have a lot of questions." "You will have time for those later," Caerthala replied with a faint, almost amused look. "For now, focus on what is in front of us." Her words were practical, but they struck him deeper than he expected. Caerthala had always been about the mission, about the here and now. But even she understood the deeper stakes of the fight. The people they were protecting, the lives that depended on their success, the world they were desperately trying to save. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something unexpected. A purpose, a connection, and in the middle of all the chaos, that was something worth fighting for. Later that evening, as the stars stretched out above the base, Reeves and Caerthala stood together, looking out into the vast expanse. There was no grand speech, no promises of victory, just the two of them, standing side by side, ready for whatever came next. "We'll win," Caerthala said after a long silence. Her voice was steady, unwavering. Reeves didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Together, they were stronger. Together, they could face anything. "I know we will," he said quietly. "But not alone." She gave him a small nod, a brief acknowledgement of their unspoken understanding. As the night settled around them, there was a moment of peace, brief but real. The war was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next. And this time, they knew they would face it together. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more epic tales of teamwork, survival, and the unbreakable bonds formed in the heat of battle, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling content just like this.